The Arctic was not always a land of silence. There was a time, before the ice settled, before everything froze into stillness, when it was a place full of life. Yet history kept no record of it. It left behind no chronicles, no monuments, no voices to tell its story. And that, in a way, is exactly what makes it more important than ever. Imagine a world that once breathed, once loved, once built things of wonder, only to be buried not by war, but by forgetting. A civilization that did not fall in tragedy, but faded like a final warm breath before an endless winter. In that vast white darkness, something might still be whispering, because even silence has memories, and ice, too, remembers what the world tries to erase. Some traces linger longer than we expect. Some stories refuse to die, even when everything around them has turned to frost. Tonight, on Bedtime History, we will listen for what remains beneath the frozen layers and wonder how many parts of human history were locked in ice before they ever had the chance to be written down, maybe more than we think. We grew up with the image of a blinding white Arctic, a place where the cold feels as if it has existed since the very beginning, where the wind carries the whisper of eternity. But in the quiet timeline of this planet, nothing is truly permanent. There was once an Arctic that did not know ice at all, where trees reached upward not to resist the cold, but to welcome the sun. Not a barren steppe or a thin line of forest along the frost, but a genuinely green land, rich with underground rivers, tall timber, long seasons and fresh water. In a place that now holds only names on a map and frozen sand, people have found in the soil the fossils of ancient cypresses that once thrived in a mild climate, pieces of wood turned to stone, yet still marked with the grain lines of a warm and living world. And it was not only the trees. In the deep frozen ground beneath the feet of modern Siberia and Alaska, ancient bones still surface from time to time: mammoths, steppe bison, woolly rhinoceroses, a long list of creatures that lived in a climate far from today's relentless cold. These scenes, as though lifted out of time, remain not as monuments, but as moments preserved, as if someone once passed through and left behind a handful of memories in the grasslands that have now turned to stone. And if animals once walked those fields, could it be that humans were there as well, not merely wandering, but living, remembering, and calling that place home? Before the ice sealed everything, Arctic summers were not a warning, but an invitation. The Gulf Stream did not stop halfway across the ocean. Instead, it curled deep into the far north, carrying warmth not as a miracle, but as the natural heartbeat of a breathing Earth. The planet's axial tilt, something we often imagine to be fixed, once shifted slightly, just enough to change the way sunlight fell across the high latitudes. And in the strange quiet between cold cycles, a window of time opened, as if waiting for someone to leave a footprint. Maybe it was a person, maybe a memory, maybe something that has never had a name. Across climate rhythms older than any civilization, there were brief stretches when the environment was so stable we could almost call them the seasons of culture. Like a pause between two powerful waves, a moment when memory had a chance to take root, when a story could be carried across generations. And whatever once stood there, whether a simple tool or a glimpse through firelight, was it buried completely or merely forgotten because it no longer fits the map we use today? We know of places like Doggerland and Sunderland, continents that sank beneath the sea yet left traces in DNA, in legends, in archaeological anomalies. But the North, where summer daylight lingers for weeks without fading, remains a blank space, a region without a name, without words, without a record in any ancient map. And perhaps that is why it remains so evocative, a whisper with no clear meaning, yet enough to make us pause and listen. Ice did not come as a disaster, but as a deep sleep. It pressed down layer by layer, unhurried yet unyielding. Streams lost their paths. Animals paused, then vanished. And somewhere in that long transition, the last human footprints may have retreated, not out of fear, but because the rhythm of the world had shifted. No walls fell, no final flames burned out. Only a place once full of life slipping quietly into silence, as if it had never been anything at all. So what remains from the days before the snow returned? Perhaps a bone fragment, perhaps a faint carving, perhaps a wind that still blows along old roots. But more importantly, perhaps the question itself remains: did anyone once call that land home? Did someone ever wake to a bright summer morning and look toward the horizon as if they were standing at the center of the world? That question will carry us forward, not to build a new Atlantis, but to listen to every stone trace, every heartbeat of the earth, every dream lingering in bone. Not to declare that they existed, but to ask, if they truly lived, then why has the memory faded so deeply? And if something once blossomed in the farthest north, do we still have the patience to reach for its final breath? If the layers of fossils and sediments show that the Arctic was once green, then the next step feels almost unavoidable. Had anyone ever gone there? Not to claim it, not to conquer it, but simply to walk and leave something behind for the wind to keep. The answer is not found in buried cities or fallen stone pillars, but in fragments so small they could disappear into the sand, a sliver of stone blade caught in frozen soil, a lone grain of pollen drifting into a lake, a fossilized footprint lying still between two cycles of melting ice. The fragility of these clues makes them even more believable because no one tried to leave a mark, and yet the marks remain. The great boreal forest belt, stretching like an ecological bridge from Siberia to Alaska, once offered an invisible path for the first people to step away from the warmth, away from familiar firelight, and into the pale, wordless glow of the north. Not because they were pushed, but perhaps because something was calling them. The wind from the Arctic carried no promises, yet it carried a feeling, as if something was waiting. Their footsteps left faint, scattered traces across wide distances, from Kolyma to Yana, from Lake Baikal to the foothills of Verkhoyansk. Places that seem too far, too cold, and yet still echo with the presence of humans from tens of thousands of years ago. One of the brightest points in this mysterious mosaic is Yana RHS, where signs of human life date to around 31,000 years, far earlier than anyone thought possible. And it was not only stone tools or fire traces, there were mammoth tusks carved into ornaments, animal teeth strung as pendants, proof that these people did more than survive. They remembered, they told stories, they dreamed, and such dreams could not have risen from a land that was entirely brutal. Either the region was once warmer, or something more important than survival drew them toward it. In newer theories, scholars are beginning to move away from the idea that all migrations were born of necessity. Perhaps there were lands that ancient peoples saw as invitations, not punishments, not barren fields, but unnamed worlds opening before them like blank pages. And interestingly, from Siberia to Alaska, in the stories of the Chukchi, the Evenki, the Inuit, and the Sami, there are echoes of a northern place that was never foreign, a place where the sun never set, a place their ancestors once traveled to, a place their spirits would return to, not because of death, but because that land had once been home. When these voices are placed beside matching tools, similar burial customs, and rock carvings scattered across thousands of miles, they begin to form a kind of map that needs no borders. No one taught these groups to connect, and yet somehow they repeated the same shapes, held on to the same cultural rhythm, as if something once existed across the ice, across the distance. And if there was a rhythm, then there must have been a center, a place not only to arrive at, but to return to. A kind of pole, not the geographical North Pole, but a pole of the mind, a point toward which every direction seemed to lead. The genetic maps of ancient people from sites like Malta, Duvanyar, and Yana reveal something unexpected. They did not vanish, and they were not isolated. They formed one of the connecting links in a genetic chain stretching from Europe to Asia, and from Asia to the Americas. Which means they lived, they loved, they traveled, they left something behind inside the bodies of those who came after. They needed no writing, no monuments, only bones, only sequences of genes, and a little quiet for us to listen. Because the things humans fail to understand are often the most important things they once possessed. So if they did not stop at the forest's edge but continued northward, what awaited them there? Not death, but perhaps continuous light. Not bitter frost, but lakes that had not yet frozen, grasslands that did not yet know winter, or maybe even a world that has now disappeared but once existed, not as a city, but as a way of living, a rhythm of breath, long enough for someone to still dream of it. And in those dreams, they walk toward the light. From above, the Arctic appears like a shattered mirror covered in ice, with no shore, no edge, just a white ocean curled in silence beneath a thick veil of mist. But long ago, that place was not a sea, it was land, a vast stretch of ground untouched by ice, flat enough to walk across without stumbling, solid enough to support migrating herds, early human groups and memories that were never given names. When global sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are today, the coastlines of the Arctic reached out like extensions of the continents, not yet divided by oceans, not yet swallowed by time. Underwater plateaus and mountain ridges now erased from modern maps were once plains, once home. We often speak of Doggerland as a sunken memory, the land that once connected Britain to Europe before melting ice pulled it under. But in the far north, there were other versions of what has been lost, places modern maps now label with cold terms like East Siberian Continental Shelf or Chukchi Margin. These scientific names tell us nothing about what once happened there, only the emptiness of coordinates, the outlines of geological charts with no people in them. Yet beneath the permafrost and wind-blown sand along Siberia's edge lie different traces, animal bones, ancient sands, and even shells from freshwater shores, quietly revealing a world where life was once stable, cyclical, and tied to land that no longer exists. The question is not only who once lived there, but also what erased them from the world. The answer is water. Not a single towering wave, but billions of tons of melting ice pouring into the oceans without a sound. In just a few millennia, sea levels rose more than 120 meters, an enormous number, yet slow. Slow enough that humans did not realize they were losing their homeland, slow enough that river villages became islands, islands became sandbars, and sandbars became waves. Not a great flood, but countless small tides, each one enough to wipe away a layer of memory, an old footprint, a story once told around the fire. In the ancient stories of the Yupik, Inuit, and Evenki peoples, there are always tales of a place where their ancestors lived in the middle of the sea, a place now gone. We often call these legends. But what if these stories are not myths at all, but blurred memories? Memories repeated until the details faded, but the feeling remained. If so, those stories might be maps, not drawn by hand, but spoken. And guided by those maps, modern researchers have begun to look beneath the ocean's surface, where today's technology reveals strange signs, ancient shorelines abruptly cut off dried riverbeds etched into the seafloor like scars, and even pockets of fresh groundwater still hiding beneath the ocean. The last proof that this land once breathed open air. If a community ever lived along the ancient Arctic coasts, then it would have been the easiest community to erase. Not because of war, not because of fire, but because of water. The land they lived on may have been swallowed so gently that no one heard it disappear. No collapsing cities, no falling stone pillars, only sand, waves, and time. And now, when we look back, we see nothing. Not because nothing existed, but because everything worth finding lies far outside the familiar maps. Perhaps they did not live deep within the continents at all, but along flat coastal plains, plains that today are the coldest ocean floor on Earth. This forces us to redefine disappearance. It does not require tragedy or cries or final flames. Sometimes it is only a quiet process, water rising, land retreating, people moving on, and memory fading like mist. And no one retells it, not because no one survived, but because generations later no one remembers that place ever existed. A land that was once real, once warm, once alive. Now reduced to a blank space in collective memory, a line erased without notice. But if we know where to listen, there may still be echoes. Beneath the ocean floor, in layers of sediment, in fresh water that salt has not yet claimed, something may still be waiting. Not to be proven, but to be remembered. Not to return, but to be heard once more. Because not all cultures are built from stone. Some are woven from wind, from the path of tides, from faint footprints in the mud. And when the sea takes everything away, sometimes it does not bury it. It merely hides it to see who still remembers. Life does not survive on light and water alone. It needs something quieter, yet absolutely essential: stability. Not the warmest place, not the most fertile, but the kind of place where tomorrow can be predicted. A place where someone can plant a seed without fearing it will freeze overnight. And strangely, in Earth's long and unpredictable history, there was a time when the land considered the most unstable was the place that offered that very stability. The Arctic, during rare moments between ice ages, became calm enough to nurture something beyond survival. Memory. During the interglacial periods, especially at the beginning of the Holocene, around 10,000 to 8,000 years before the Common Era, the ancient ice withdrew like a long farewell. The ground opened, rivers and lakes spilled from melting glaciers, vegetation spread rapidly as if remembering itself as forest. Average temperatures were not only warmer than today, but remained steady for thousands of years, a nearly impossible condition for the polar world. It is no surprise that ancient people, long accustomed to hardship, were drawn to that quiet. Not because it was the easiest place to live, but because it was a place where one could remember. To remember is the first foundation of culture. When humans no longer need to fight for each day of survival, they begin to leave traces. Not in writing, but in repetition. They fished with the seasons, gathered with the cycles, migrated with the winds. And when actions repeat themselves in an environment that allows it, those actions become symbols. Knowledge does not need books, only stable land and a generation patient enough to retell. They did not write, but they recorded in pathways, in glances, in gestures. They had no maps, but they could navigate by sky colors and the rhythm of waves. Earth's axial tilt during that era created polar summers that stretched across weeks. No night, only unbroken daylight. Light for plants to grow, and for thoughts to grow too. They learned to listen to the sun, to know when to move, when to harvest, when to wait, no longer fleeing winter but living alongside it, like a dialogue with the climate, and in that dialogue a language formed, not a language of words, but of rituals. In the folklore of the northern world, repetition is sacred. Each year, each journey, each ceremony mirrored what ancestors once did, not out of a lack of imagination, but because they believed memory lived in rhythm. And rhythm exists only when nature makes space for it. Their culture had no walls, no writing, but it had dances symbolizing the melting of ice, tattoos marking the direction of wind, songs describing the return of the reindeer herds. A civilization not built in stone, but in the trust that tomorrow could echo today. And if civilization is the organization of memory, then why dismiss the possibility that the Arctic once held such a cradle? Just because there are no pillars or pots does not mean there were no societies, no symbols, no systems. Perhaps everything they created lived within the body, carried in footsteps, in breath, in the way their eyes followed the horizon, and was swept away by wind, by time, by shifting seasons that no one recorded. Or perhaps it is still there. We simply have not been quiet enough to hear it at the right frequency. Climate researchers today are not merely measuring temperatures in ice cores or ancient lake sediments. They are searching for rare windows in time when the weather became gentle, long enough for something miraculous to take root. The possibility that a frozen land once knew how to wait, how to renew, how to tell stories. And if those stories ever existed, they would not appear on paper, but in the steadiness of the wind, in the return paths of ancient travelers, in the eyes of descendants who still follow the old routes. But if life once blossomed within such stability, what happens when that stability ends? When the rhythm breaks, when summers stop arriving on time, when even the light becomes uncertain, does memory still have a place to survive? Or will everything dissolve into mist, as if it never existed at all? That question, quiet but insistent, will guide us into the next part of this journey, where climate change is not only a natural event, but a force that fractures memory itself. When a city disappears from the map, people often assume its story ends with it, but the memory of the earth does not move in straight lines. A community may scatter, a culture may fade from sight. Yet certain things cannot be erased. Not fallen temples, not carved stone slabs, but details far more modest, a broken piece of stone, a cut mark on a bone, a string of beads left behind in frozen soil. And in that modesty, memory finds a chance to survive, even if only as a thin breath. Along the Yana River in Siberia's brutal cold, a place once believed too harsh for humans to endure at the end of the last ice age, archaeologists found the opposite. More than 2,000 artifacts made of stone, mammoth ivory, and animal bone, some dating back 31,000 years. Not only tools for survival, but also bead strings, ornaments, bone needles with eyelets, evidence that human hands shaped objects not merely to live, but to feel, to remember, to mark meaning. These objects did not feed the stomach, but they fed memory. And that is where civilization begins. At Bluefish Caves in Yukon, Canada, clear-cut marks on animal bones revealed signs of human activity from 24,000 years ago, thousands of years earlier than history once allowed. Such small traces force us to redraw the map of memory, to let go of the assumption that humans ventured north only after the climate softened. Because if they were there in the cold, it means they once had a reason to choose this place. And that reason may not have been survival, but the stability that once existed. There was no war, no catastrophe, no single event, only a moment when summer did not return, when winds shifted, when herds failed to come back, and people had to withdraw, leaving behind a few broken tools, a patch of burnt sediment, a fox tooth strung as a pendant, objects no longer intact, yet enough to say they'd once understood order, once told stories, once believed in something beyond the daily meal. These are not the marks of instinct, but the signatures of symbolism. A strand of fox-tooth beads found in Kamchatka is not merely decoration. To an anthropologist, it is a sign of roles, of ritual, of emotion encoded into form. When a society differentiates tools for labor from tools for offering, when it separates the useful from the meaningful, then it has crossed the boundary of mere survival and entered the realm of collective memory. Not because they built stone houses, but because they saw in a broken bone needle something more than convenience. We often imagine civilization as pyramids, temples, writing, but in truth it begins the moment humans create something unnecessary, yet essential to the soul. A drawing on stone, a tattoo that recounts a journey, an eyelet carved into a needle. And when such things remain, even beneath ice, even as fragments, that civilization has not vanished. It is simply waiting for someone quiet enough to hear it again. What is striking is that these artifacts are often found along ancient shorelines, not deep inland. This aligns with the idea that our ancestors traveled along the Arctic coasts, following fish, seals, and the cycles of large animals. And if those coasts vanished when sea levels rose, then their memories were pulled away with them, carried off with land that slipped beneath the water. Not forgotten, but displaced, because the ground they lived on is no longer where it once was. We think of archaeology as the search for remains, but sometimes it is the act of listening to what is almost gone, a stone worn smooth by many hands, a patch of soil charred long ago, an ivory button lying out of place. They do not form a complete story, but they open the possibility of a structure, a network, a concept of life no longer measured by tools alone, but by the way the old world left messages for the future. And if those messages still wait within the ice, then what we are about to uncover is not just evidence, but an entire way of thinking that once existed without needing a name. A memory structure without walls. A culture that did not require light, because darkness and silence were the places where it lasted the longest. There is a quiet truth, clear as snow, settling on stone. The first people to set foot in the Arctic were not the Inuit. Today, the Inuit embody life in the polar cold, with their language, knowledge, and culture shaped for extreme conditions. But they arrived late, part of a much more recent migration from Siberia, roughly 1,000 years ago. That leaves an empty space in the record, not born from doubt, but from silence. Then who came before? In a land without writing, where history is not carved onto stone but buried in ice and ash, the earliest people left no names, no nations, no chronicles, no stories saved in ink. Yet they remain, in bones sealed beneath permafrost, in stone tools worn smooth, in the ash of fires that died out tens of thousands of years ago. And sometimes, faint but undeniable, they echo in old folk tales as nameless figures, never fully seen but never fully gone. They are called many things: Paleo-Arctic, pre-Dorset, Paleo-Siberians, or quieter labels like the unclassified cultures. But those are just modern attempts to name a past that did not speak. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what they thought when the aurora lit the sky above a world without firelight. We do not know whether they saw the long winter night as a threat or as an introduction to something sacred. All we know is this: they were there, and their presence can no longer be denied. At the Ushki archaeological site on the cold rim of Kamchatka, researchers found human remains, microblades, and hearth ash dating back 13,000 years. Unexpected parallels surfaced in Alaska, at Dry Creek, Walker Road, and continued across northern Canada, forming a steady rhythm pointing to a journey that once existed. Tool patterns reveal refinement, repetition, structure, not the randomness of drifters, but the cadence of a community with memory, with continuity. As genetic maps were redrawn using ancient bones, an unfamiliar lineage appeared, a branch now called the ancient North Siberians. Their genetic signatures show up in samples from Siberia and Alaska, yet they do not fully match East Asian groups nor the indigenous peoples of the Americas today. A branch that once existed, then vanished. A limb broken off the ancestral tree without leaving leaves behind. But if a branch once grew from the trunk, it means this: it lived. And as with all things buried too deeply, sometimes we must turn to myth to hear the first whisper. In Inuit tradition, there are stories of a people called the Tunit, those who lived before them, large, strong, quiet, almost silent. They were not defeated, not driven out. They simply withdrew, moving northward, toward a place where the light no longer returned. A disappearance not shaped by war, but by a drifting into mist. And in that story, there is something that does not feel like myth at all. The idea of those who came before is not unique to the Arctic. All across the world, cultures speak of earlier people whose details have faded, remembered with reverence more than clarity. It is as if humanity carries a folded corner in its collective memory, a crease where unnamed history lies tucked away, but never erased. They were the ones who placed the first stones, then stepped back so others could continue. And for that reason, their presence runs deeper than anything ever written. We may not know their names, their language, or their faces, but the same style of axe sharpening appears thousands of miles apart. The same arrowhead design repeats from one frozen shore to another. These traces, though they do not form a map, create a chain of connection that cannot be dismissed. And perhaps the silence they left behind was exactly how they wished to be remembered. Not through words, but through climate, through the shape of stone, through the direction the wind moves across untouched snow. If they truly lived this way, while leaving no cities but leaving relationships with the land, erecting no stone statues but listening to the sound of freezing water, then can we continue to define civilization by metal, by writing, by temples? Or is it time to recognize another kind of civilization, quieter, not needing remembrance, yet still persisting? Perhaps they, the unnamed, the unwritten, are the very first layer of northern memory. And if that is true, then the rest of this journey is not only a search for truth, but an invitation to relearn how to listen to things that were never written down. No one truly forgets the first time they see the aurora. The green, violet, and red bands of light that twist like a living being, quietly gliding across the frozen night sky. It does not arrive like lightning, nor fade like the moon. It feels as if a breath from another world has slipped in. To modern people, we call it a phenomenon, solar wind brushing against the ionosphere. But to those who lived beneath that sky thousands of years ago, this light was not a phenomenon. It was a presence, a doorway. For the Inuit, the aurora is not only beautiful, it is alive. In certain traditions, it is the spirits of ancestors returning, dancing and playing across the heavens, not to frighten, not to warn, but to remind us that life does not end with death. It merely shifts shape. These spirits are not invisible, they shine. They do not depart, they return. Among the Sami of Scandinavia, the aurora is so sacred that pointing at it is forbidden, because it hears, it feels the presence of people. Some groups believe the aurora is will itself, the living expression of the other world. Not only in living traditions, but in stone memory remains. Across rock faces from Norway to Siberia, repeating symbols appear: spirals, arcs, flame-like curves, linking human figures caught in transformation or animals in states of becoming. No one dares claim with certainty that these depict the aurora. But if you have ever seen that light, you know, nothing else looks closer. Once those curves enter memory, they cannot be confused with anything else. So who first looked up at the aurora and saw not light, but spirit? Perhaps it was the first people, the communities who lived before writing, before named history, who first gave meaning to the sky. If the aurora follows a cyclical rhythm, appearing with the turning of the sun, then maybe its repetition was the foundation of memory. And if memory can be transmitted through light, then the aurora was a living record, a symbol that outlived eras. In a frozen world where everything beneath the feet stands still, only the sky moves, and when the sky moves, it carries messages. There were no books, no electricity, no compass. In that long night, the aurora itself was a sign, a living library, a signal, as if the heavens once stood closer to the earth, and that light was the brief bridge where two realms touched before pulling away again in silence. Even stranger, communities with no contact, and from North Asia to Northern Europe, from the Inuit to the Ainu, from Scandinavia to Hokkaido, all keep similar fragments of memory. Some believe the aurora is where souls are born. Some say it is the light that carries souls away. Others see it as a sign that something sacred is approaching. It cannot be coincidence. It cannot simply be cultural exchange. Many of these groups lived isolated for thousands of years, yet shared the same feeling, that the sky can speak, and the aurora is its voice. The question now is no longer whether the aurora held meaning. It is, did the aurora help preserve the memory of the North? Was that light the pillar of an unwritten worldview, one where every being had spirit, where the boundary between life and death stayed open, where light was the witness to every departure and return? A world that did not record thought, but lived through sensation. A world that did not define symbols, but allowed symbols to appear whenever the sky shifted. If there truly was a culture that grew up alongside the aurora, one that did not carve letters into stone, but passed on songs, dances, and the posture of those who stood in the dark, then perhaps that memory never vanished. It merely changed form. It lives in the eyes of those who look upward when there is nothing left beneath their feet to hold on to. And in that gaze, quiet, deep, wordless, a culture might be breathing again. Because today, when we look at the aurora, we see beauty, but perhaps they once saw life, a form of life not meant to be touched, but meant to move through, an archway of light, not leading anywhere specific, but leading inward, back to the deepest memory every culture carries, that there is a kind of light, quiet yet unforgettable. And perhaps if we are silent enough beneath that sky, we may hear again a culture that was never written, yet always present. Before the ice melted and the waters rose, before the forests returned, before humans were remembered as storytellers, there was another world. People call it the Mammoth Steppe, the Mammoth Grassland. Not because it was full of mammoths, but because the mammoth is simply the easiest thing to remember. A land stretching like a cold breath from Europe across Siberia, over the Bering Land Bridge, and into Alaska and the Yukon. No tall trees, no thick forests, only low grass, thorny shrubs, thin snow, a place not dead, but never easy to live in. And that world had people, No palaces, no temples, only cut marks on animal bone, human footprints beside reindeer tracks, tools sharpened so precisely they could only be used on the dry, frozen ground of permafrost. These people did not come to conquer, but to quietly merge with the rhythm of migration, no domestication, no ownership. They listened to the wind, learned the roots of animals, felt the darkness as if it were a language. They hunted not for glory, but because they had to live. Imagine a day on the frozen steppe. The sun never rises high, the light silver like mist that refuses to lift. Wind cuts across the grass like a thin blade. In the distance, a herd of mammoths moves slowly, like mountains that breathe. On a ridge of stone, a small group of people waits, not rushed, not speaking. They have learned one rule: in a world where mistakes are not forgiven, patience is the strongest weapon. And there, in that setting, tools of astonishing precision were created. Spearheads carved with blood grooves, hide scrapers, fire-making techniques that produced no smoke. Everything was knowledge, recorded not in writing, but in repeated action. Some places, like Duvani Yar along the Kolyma River, reveal something deeper: human bones and animal bones lying side by side, not by accident, but as if buried together in ritual, a form of reverence, a kind of coexistence in a world that offered no mercy. And that feeling did not vanish when the mammoth steppe faded away. Among later peoples like the Inuit and Chukchi, animals were never just meat. Every hunt was a ceremony. Every act of skinning was a remembrance. Perhaps that sense began on the frozen steppe itself, where humans and animals read the same wind, shared the same silence, and walked through the same dusk. And perhaps within that world, the earliest cultures quietly took shape. Not built around fields, but around herds. Not marking time by harvests, but by journeys. By the blood traces left on stone. By memories of places where someone paused, and where someone did not return. If civilization is the ability to remember, then the people of the mammoth steppe drew a living map that existed not on paper, but within memory. Who traveled where? Who was lost when? Who once saw a herd change direction? Everything was data, memory, a sensory system that needed no compass. Then the climate changed, the grasslands shrank, the mammoths disappeared. It was not only food that vanished, the entire structure of life dissolved. The master hunters had to shift. Some faded into the forests, some disappeared without a trace, some, perhaps, carried their memory with them, drifting south and west toward warmer ground. But what did they bring? Not mammoths, not the spearheads, but an idea that one can live in a world without owning it. That order can exist without walls. That ritual can exist without mythology. And if that idea still lingers, hidden in the later myths of other peoples, then perhaps the remnants of the mammoth steppe world have not fully disappeared. They do not stand out. They do not call to us. But maybe, each time someone bends down to pick up a stone with an unfamiliar worn edge, or pauses beneath a nameless cold wind, an old memory brushes against the present, like a breath that never quite faded, still lingering on the earth. Every culture, early or late, leaves behind something more enduring than pottery or tools: language. Not merely a system of words, but a way of sensing the world, a way to distinguish shades of light, to name different kinds of wind, to count time not by numbers but by shifts in the sky or the patterns of animal steps. Language is memory given shape, a living map of the knowledge that never needed pen or paper. But what happens when a language disappears? Not because it was replaced or suppressed, but because the people who carried it dissolved into ice, into silence. no one left to retell, no one who stayed long enough to pass on what had been spoken. And in the Arctic, that silence is the thickest thing of all, thicker than the ancient ice itself. When linguists began examining the language families of Arctic peoples, from the Chukchi and Koryak of Siberia to the Inuit Yupik of Canada and the Na-Dene groups of interior North America, they found no single unifying system, yet they kept encountering echoes, phonetic traces, grammatical patterns, structural seams as if once woven together into a single tapestry, now pulled apart by time, syllables that resonate, suffixes that mirror each other, word divisions that feel like reflections of an older form, a language that once existed as a shared root, now scattered in fragments around the northern circle. From that idea emerges the image of a northern mother tongue, one that left no manuscripts, no alphabet. It survives in the words different communities use for snow, for light, for spirit, for frozen lakes, for silence. Inuit, for example, has kanik for snow, falling as individual flakes, distinct from a put, snow settled on the ground. Evenki has dozens of terms for ice. These words do more than describe. They represent a relationship of survival, of understanding, knowledge wrapped inside sound and meaning, passed on through breath. What is astonishing is this. There are no equivalents for these terms in southern languages. These concepts seem born from frozen soil, from cold air, from lived experience, not borrowed, not learned from others, but arising naturally as reflex. And if such linguistic textures are shared across groups separated by thousands of kilometers, then could it be that there was once a language spanning the north before the world was divided into nations? Some scholars call it Proto-Arctic or the Paleo-Siberian route, temporary names for something that cannot be properly named. While debates continue, computational models show that the probability of these northern grammatical similarities being accidental is surprisingly low, as if somewhere beneath every difference a single thread still runs through, linking people who once lived under the same sky and named the same unbounded world. The reason this hypothesis feels profound is precisely because we can no longer hear that language, because it was never written, because as the environment changed, as the climate softened, humans no longer needed 30 words for different kinds of cold wind, no longer needed to pass down terms that only made sense to those living among snow. And so the language lost its function. No one kept it, no one taught it, no one called its words aloud. And memory, like a forgotten song, faded quietly into the silence. But some things never fully die. A lullaby no one understands is still sung. An ancient word appears in a ritual even if no one remembers its meaning. A storytelling style survives within a family that never left its ancestral land. That is where memory still breathes, not loudly, not clearly, but like wind moving through cracks of ice. Real, just difficult to hear. If such a language ever existed, it may have shaped an entire way of perceiving the universe, not separating humans from nature, not dividing sentence from meaning. A world without beginnings or ends, only the flow of states of life, of light and shadow. And perhaps we still have a chance to glimpse it, not through books, but through the voices of elders who never left their homeland. Because sometimes what we call lost is simply what has never been heard properly. There was no thunderous warning, no great flood, no volcano darkening the sky, only a slow, patient, almost gentle shifting of cold, a slight change in ocean currents, a rhythm slipping out of place, unnoticed, until stability became a memory. And in that in-between time, there were people still living as if tomorrow would resemble today, unaware they were the last generation to experience a full warm cycle. They were born into summers that still arrived on time, when lakes still thawed, when reindeer still returned along familiar routes, when the language of their ancestors was still whispered around the fire. The sky was still a companion, not a boundary. But then the patterns that had once repeated began to drift. Winds no longer came from the old direction. Animals no longer followed old paths. Winter lingered longer and summer thinned, fragile as a breath that never fills the lungs. Roots could no longer reach water. Stones grew colder. Ice grew thicker. And the only thing that did not change was memory. In sediment cores taken from Lake El-Gigitgin in Siberia, scientists found evidence of a gradual cooling after the warm Holocene optimum, not sudden, but steady and enduring. Just a shift of a few degrees and cycles fractured, seasons shortened, sources of life grew unpredictable. Extinction was not required, only a slowness too subtle to notice. And so memory began to fall out of alignment. Rituals once meaningful became hollow repetitions. Stories no longer helped people navigate the world. The sun still rose, but not close enough. Those who continued living the old way, waiting for the wind, hunting with the seasons, trusting that the land still knew their names, now faced a world in which their names were no longer spoken. A community can survive without abundance, but it cannot survive when its memories no longer match reality. And so they withdrew, not in despair, but in silence, as if leaving only to avoid this winter. Not knowing that winter would never end, they moved toward the forest edges, toward waters that did not freeze, toward places where the light lingered more than an hour, and they faded into legend, no names, no records, but those who came later felt them. When the Inuit arrived in the Arctic millennia afterward, they found no living people. But they found places that had once held fire. They found tools unlike their own. And above all, they found a feeling that someone had once been there, once known this sky, once named the snow in a way the wind still remembered. That feeling cannot be spoken, but it appears in the wary way they watched the aurora. In the belief that souls do not go downward into the earth, but drift horizontally across the ice, moving with the seasons. And in these nameless remnants, the older civilization did not disappear. It merely changed form. It was no longer a community, no longer a home, but a seed that had not sprouted, a lullaby no longer understood, a breathing rhythm still lingering somewhere in the dreams of those who live on snow. The Ice Age did not erase it, it only froze it, like a story paused mid-sentence. Not because it ended, but because the storyteller was gone. Yet if one day someone learns again how to listen, the story may continue. Not every collapse is loud. A civilization can disappear in silence, without an explosion, without a burn mark, without a fortress falling, without a stone statue shattering in panic. Things that once arrived on time simply begin to drift. Familiar paths lead to places that hold nothing. Old cycles stop aligning. And the people, who once lived by the rhythm of the world, suddenly no longer know which season belongs to which action. And perhaps that is exactly what happened in the north. A land long dismissed as empty, uninhabitable, suddenly reveals signs of structure, not scattered, but systematic. Not a handful of small hunting bands, but a network that once carried shared memory, shared symbols, tools with defined roles, rituals with deliberate shape. And what shocks us is not that they existed, but how they withdrew, leaving no echoes behind, only silence, Along the Arctic coast of Siberia, archaeologists found clusters of dwellings all oriented toward the same prevailing wind. Food pits aligned to the sun's position, zones for skin working, zones for processing, zones for ritual, arranged as if guided by an invisible planner, never by chance. Near the Yana River, ivory tools were carved with such precision that researchers suspect they were not merely utilitarian, but markers of something larger: authority, memory, the soul of a community. And in Alaska, burial clusters were arranged according to the sun and the stars, as if a sacred map once stretched between earth and sky. No one does that unless they believe in meaning, and no one sustains that unless a structure has been passed down through generations. If this is not civilization, then what is it? Not a city-shaped one, but a memory-shaped one. Not built from stone, but built from repetition and preservation. A quiet civilization, not measured in height, but in depth. But then climate shifted. What vanished first was not food, it was structure. When winters grew too long, settlements unraveled. When animals changed migration routes, exchange networks broke apart. When new generations stopped performing rituals, symbols lost their meaning. Culture began to fracture. Without custodians, tradition faded. Without tradition, community dissolved. And without community, civilization shattered. No one knows exactly when they disappeared. There was no final year, no singular event, only the last people living with old memories in a world that no longer accepted those memories. Perhaps they tried to recreate the old tools, tried to retell ancestral myths, tried to keep the old rhythm of breath, but the world had shifted, and memory grew rootless. There were no temples collapsing, but there were signs of a network unraveling, tools growing less refined, symbols becoming simplified, beliefs shrinking into mere customs. Those who remained survived, but no longer belonged to the original culture. They were remnants, like drifting ice no longer attached to the great sheet that had melted away. And yet, collapse does not always mean an ending. Some groups carried fragments of that memory as they moved south, into the taiga forests, into warmer grasslands. They retold stories with missing pieces, sang songs missing their lines, performed rituals that had lost their names. But the core spirit survived. And if we are patient enough to thread those fragments together, we may see an image emerge, a civilization that once lived, once thrived in silence, and also faded in silence. Not every migration begins with catastrophe. Some departures carry no cries, no smoke, only a nameless sorrow felt when the land can no longer hold memory, when the rhythm that once guided life begins to fall out of tune. In the far north, this may have happened long ago. Not a flight, but a slow unraveling, like smoke thinning into cold wind, as people who once called ice their home realized they were living inside a world whose heartbeat no longer matched their own. When the climate began slipping away from its warm period, stability, at the pillar beneath every ancient culture, started to fracture. Summers shrank, winters stretched into unbroken chains, grass no longer grew enough to feed the herds, lakes remained sealed in ice year-round, animals shifted their migratory routes, and the people, once part of this cycle, began losing their anchor. What remained was not a society, but scattered groups struggling to preserve a way of life that no longer had ground to stand on. There were no councils, no meetings. The decision to leave did not come from ideology, but from intuition, an ancient instinct in communities who lived close to nature, the sense that it was time to find a place where memory would not be buried. And so they left, quietly, without ruins, without traces of violence, only a few footprints leading away from the place that had been home, as if they were not fleeing but carrying a flame elsewhere so it would not die. These traveling groups carried little. Only knowledge that could be spoken, symbolic belongings that held meaning beyond their size, and stories small enough to store in memory. Some traveled westward along the Ural range, where the climate softened. The Nenets, Komi and Mansi may carry faint echoes of that legacy, not only in blood, but in the way they build fire, the way they tell stories, the way they look at the aurora with a caution that feels inherited, as if it were the place where spirits linger. Others moved south following the great rivers, the Ob, the Lena, the Yenisei, the lifelines of vast Siberia. In the lands they passed through, communities such as the Evenki, Selkup, and Yakut would later take shape. And in their rituals we still glimpse layered cosmologies, earth, sky, and an unseen inner realm, a threefold universe not constructed from doctrine, but from intuition born during life on ancient ice. The final wave, perhaps the most distant, crossed the Bering Land Bridge when its waters had not yet drawn boundaries. They stepped into the Americas carrying northern wind, carrying quiet symbols, spirals, wind spirits, dawn ceremonies, patterns that would later appear scattered across cultures from Alaska to the Amazon rainforest. No one remembers their names, but many traditions still speak of the first people from the north who arrived, then departed, leaving tools and silence. And, strangely, their migration did not destroy or it planted. They brought no temples, but they carried spirit. They built no empires, but they carried a way of understanding the world, that humans do not stand above nature, but live inside its rhythm. And when they reached new places, warm forests, wide rivers, high mountains, their old memories took root quietly, growing like seeds with no proper name, yet turning green whenever the climate allowed. We do not know what they said to one another in the last hours before leaving the ice, but perhaps something like this was whispered beside the final fire. We will go, but as long as we remember the sound of wind across the frozen plain, as long as we tell the story of the sun rising over a white horizon, we will still be ourselves. And that is how they left, not to forget, but to preserve memory from the cold that was closing in. There are chapters in human history that were never told in words, never written in script, never carved onto stone or painted on cave walls, never passed down through ancestral storytelling. They do not appear on maps or in libraries. They were preserved in a quieter way, in bodies, in the invisible twists of DNA, in silent sequences that modern humans are only now beginning to understand. And when the light of genetics first shone into that deep layer of memory, something strange emerged. There were once people who lived, loved, bore children, and died, yet left behind no community that carries their full legacy today. In the frigid lands of Siberia, ancient skeletons recovered from permafrost revealed genetic structures unlike any people alive today. Some belong to a group now called the ancient North Siberians, humans who lived more than 30,000 years ago in a place where surviving a modern winter seems almost impossible. They were not ancestors of East Asians, nor of Europeans, nor the direct forebears of indigenous peoples in the Americas. They were a separate branch, a distant limb on the human evolutionary tree, and sadly, one that broke away. And yet, they did not vanish completely. Though no existing population bears their name, a faint trace of them remains, a thin shadow in the DNA of a few indigenous Siberian and Central Asian groups. Like a whisper running through the bloodstream, they live on not as a people, but as a biological memory that never fully faded. No one tells their stories, but the bodies of later generations still carry pieces of them, as if the human form itself became the archive when language could no longer hold what needed to be remembered. Another example is the group known as the ancient North Eurasians, who lived around 20,000 years ago. They became the genetic ancestors of modern Europeans, indigenous peoples of the Americas, and many Central Asian populations. Yet the ANE themselves no longer survive as any distinct community. They were the beginning, a crossroads, but not the destination. Like musicians who played the opening of a grand composition and then quietly left the stage, they passed the melody to others. There was a time in human history when groups were not divided the way they are today. They moved, met, mixed, forming an open genetic network where lineages flowed across continents like water through unblocked stone channels. And if this idea is correct, then the people of the ancient Arctic were the silent intersection, where many genetic streams converged before spreading in 4 directions. When the climate changed, they disappeared, but the currents they carried continued, carrying northern seeds all the way to South America, to rainforests, to high plateaus, to places no one would imagine had once heard the echo of frozen wind. The result is that today, when scientists examine the genetic maps of a Sami person in northern Europe, a Yakut in eastern Siberia, a Dene in Canada, or even a Maya individual in Central America, they still find a faint ancestral thread, like a silver filament running unbroken, linking them to people whose names are long forgotten. No one remembers them, but the body does. No story repeats their existence. But the cells still whisper something that never disappeared. It is as if the earth itself refused to let them vanish, as if it hid them in places no one thought to search, within bone, within the resonant frequency of a lullaby, within the subtle shade of an eye that turns toward the cold sun. We think ourselves separate. But in every breath, in every heartbeat, there may still be an echo of the quiet lives once lived in the far north. Long before the first written word. They no longer exist as a people, but they have not disappeared. They live on, not as a community, not as monuments, but as an undertone carried within modern humanity, steady, nameless, deeper than any carved stone. And perhaps that is the way their civilization chose to endure, not needing to be remembered by name, only needing to continue in something that no one can quite name, but that has always been there. One of the most common images of ancient Arctic peoples is that they lived in isolation, lonely sparks scattered across a frozen ocean, separated by climate, by distance, by the brutal emptiness of a land no one wished to reach. But what if the truth was the opposite? What if the place we imagine as the farthest and most remote was once the quiet center of a network, where memory, symbols, and objects moved as slowly and steadily as groundwater beneath ancient ice? Prehistoric trade did not need cities or roads. It needed only meeting points, places where people knew others would arrive, by season, by natural signals, by the private calendar of ice and sun. Exchanges could happen without a shared language, without writing, only through hands, glances, and objects. And somehow things that did not belong to that landscape appeared there, quiet traces of an older trail of memory. At the Yana RHS site in Siberia, less than 100 kilometers from the Arctic Ocean, archaeologists found obsidian fragments, a stone that does not exist in that region. It came from the south, nearly 1,000 kilometers away. Near Lake Baikal, warm-water seashells, found only near the Pacific, were discovered among northern animal bones. Such objects could not cross forests, snow, and mountains alone. They were carried, and the people who carried them left behind a muted record of a world far more connected than we ever imagined. It was not only objects. Symbols travelled too. The same double-barbed arrowheads appear across vast distances with near-identical precision. too consistent to be coincidence. They were rules, patterns, shared knowledge. Likewise, spirals and curved engraving, shapes like dreaming humans, repeat on bone, on stone, on tools, regardless of distance, as if people who shared no tribe, no language, still belonged to the same silent symbolic network, understood only by those who had once seen the northern night sky. These travellers moved not to conquer land. They built no fortresses, laid no great roads, but they left behind a flowing, invisible current, linking settlements, signals, gestures. They met where the ice first softened each year. They paused, exchanged goods, told stories, and then moved on. And the network, though unnamed, existed, living beneath the ice like roots hidden from sight, yet always connecting distant branches. No group needed to walk the entire path. They only had to pass the object to the next. A stone from the south could reach Alaska after a few generations. A story from the eastern coast could become a song beside a western lake after a few seasons. The waypoints, even now only faint traces in the soil, are the proof that the place was once a crossing, that someone had once arrived, that memory once passed through. But then the ice lost its rhythm. Water failed to melt in the right season. Winds shifted directions. The meeting points vanished. Places once used for gathering became places no one reached anymore. The network did not collapse like a tower, it dissolved, like a breath that can no longer find its old cadence, and with it, objects without explanations and symbols without names remained behind, buried by the land. No more paths, no more signals. Yet if one digs deep enough, the evidence is still there. Quiet reminders that there was once a world where people needed neither writing nor drawings to share the most sacred thing, memory. And if that is true, then the Arctic was not the edge, it was the center, not a forgotten place but a crossroads, not an ending but a hidden axis, where a civilization that never needed to take physical shape could still bind distant worlds together simply by breathing in rhythm with the wind and with the patience of ancient snow. If we imagine that the ancient people of the Arctic lived only to hunt, to endure, to survive the winter, then perhaps we have only seen their shadows reflected on the ice, never bending down to touch the depth lying still beneath the frozen ground. Because in the long months when daylight arrived only as a whispered suggestion at noon, they built spaces, not for shelter, not for fire, but for something beyond survival, ritual. Modern scholars call them ritual structures. But for those who built them, they were likely markers of memory, places where humans met the unseen, where life and death did not sit at opposite ends, but drifted past one another like two breaths crossing in the Arctic night. At Duvani Yar on the Kolyma River, researchers uncovered enormous circles made of mammoth ivory, driven deep into the earth, curved like the arms of an unnamed spirit reaching upward into the winter sky. Not to block wind, not to hold a tent, simply to exist. There were no remains nearby, no hearths, no traces of daily life, only balance, repetition, and unmistakable intention, as if someone had spent an entire season measuring each distance, setting each tusk exactly where it needed to stand, like a spell made of matter. And in places where the land held no stone, they carried stone from elsewhere, raising upright slabs, carving small aligned marks, perhaps following the sun. Some stone alcoves faced the aurora, not to observe it, but perhaps to welcome it. Maybe they did not build temples, but doorways, not to worship, but to remember. Like many civilizations that gazed upward seeking meaning, the ancient Arctic peoples may have looked at the aurora not as a phenomenon, but as a signal, a conversation in colour, the breathing of spirits. And to mark those encounters, they buried the dead with small objects, earrings, pendants, stones polished so smooth they could only have been shaped by hands that once loved. On Jokov Island, where ocean winds never rest, a triangular structure of bones and stone was arranged, with a single mammoth tusk rising at its centre, lifted as if waiting for something that never arrived. No one calls it a temple, yet it is not a house. It is an anchor, where memory, belief, and light were invited to dwell together in silence. That belief needed no language. It lived in the way each stone was placed, in curves that mean nothing to the rational eye, yet speak deeply to those who dwell within snow and stars. For them, ritual was the way to keep the unseen from drifting away, the way to hold a warmth that could not be touched, the way to build a shelter for the soul. In a land where light is the rarest gift, perhaps those ritual structures were not simply memorials, but calls for brightness to return. A tusk pointing at the sky, a stone set along the aurora's path, a carved line repeated whenever the wind changed seasons, not just arrangement, but prayer. An echo without sound hoping for an answer. And when the climate began to close in, when earth hardened and the wind carried separation, they did not tear anything down, did not flee in haste. They left everything exactly as it was the moment the last ritual ended, as if trusting that someday someone would arrive and understand that this was once a place where souls were called by name. There is a kind of forgetting as light as dust on the wind, drifting away without anyone noticing. But there is another kind of forgetting, heavy as ice pressed against stone, silent, unmovable. And sometimes forgetting does not come from memory at all, but from the simple fact that every path back has been sealed shut, one end by water, the other by ice. You cannot dive to reach it, you cannot dig to uncover it. As if someone had carefully hidden the memory in a place no human hand could ever touch. When the last ice age melted away, sea levels rose more than 100 meters. It was not the roaring flood of legend, but a wordless tide, rising season by season, decade by decade, century by century, carrying not only land away, but the stories that land once held. In the Arctic, the coastline was once twice as wide, and many communities who lived upon that vanished ground, now beneath the sea, disappeared without leaving a single cry behind. The East Siberian Sea, now a floor of frigid water, may once have been a summer station where sunlight stretched through nearly the whole day, where herds passed by and fresh meltwater flowed down from ice. The shallow shelves of Hudson Bay or the northern coast of Alaska, now drowned, may once have been inhabited rings of life, places where ancient people traveled, met, exchanged, and shared memory during the brief seasons of warmth. Now nothing rises there, only depth, and yet sometimes something is found. A stone tool resting on the seafloor where no land exists. A polished animal bone buried deep in cold sand. A silent carved fragment of mammoth tusk lying beneath more than 40 meters of water. Like echoes from a world where no one lives anymore, fragments of memory sent toward an age not yet ready to understand. The most heartbreaking part is this: no one ran, no one fled, because the water rose too slowly. A familiar riverbank retreated one step each year. A summer hunting ground turned into marsh, then into pond, then, one day, sank without warning. No one recorded the last day. No one built a final marker. Only a disappearance so quiet that no one remembered there had ever been anything worth remembering. By the time the last people left, the old ground had frozen shut. They could not return. And so the place that once held ritual, fire, and the calling of herds became only a white mirror, reflecting the sky with no remaining soul beneath it. If anyone returned long after, they would see only water, only ice, only silence. No one would say, "There was life here." No one would recall laughter rising into a night lit by aurora. Those stories could not swim. They could not wait thousands of years, and so they vanished with the people who once dreamed them. A double forgetting took place. Memory swallowed by water, then sealed by time like a locked box with no key. It was not only objects that were lost, but the very meaning of anyone having lived there at all. And when humanity finally became advanced enough to scan the seabed, to reconstruct ancient shorelines, to model the retreat of ice, it was already too late. No one remained to tell. No one waited for us to understand. The mammoth tusks, the carvings, the columns that may once have stood, were not missing because they never existed, but because they are dissolving, layer by layer, fragment by fragment, like the last hope a forgotten civilization once placed into the silence. When ice sealed the paths no one remembered, when language turned to stone in the throats of those who left and never returned, only one kind of memory could survive the long winter of history. Memory breathed out through ritual. Not written in letters, not carved into stone, not preserved in books, but held in the rhythm of the drum, in the steady breath of the soul caller, in the movement between the visible and the unseen. In places where everything disappears, where no tree grows, where footprints fade, where daylight brushes the land for only a few hours, the shaman became the living map, the living library, the living memory. They knew more than how to survive. They knew the way home for the soul. They understood the path of the wind, the spot where darkness retreats to make room for the year's first light. They were the eyes between worlds, the last ones who could speak the language of what cannot be spoken. And in a world with no written map, that role was not power, it was life and death. Shamans did not rule, they preserved. They kept safe the one thing too precious to lose, the sense of an order larger than humankind. Perhaps they never called themselves shamans, but their traces remain in the cultures that survived the great unraveling, among the Yukagir, the Chukchi, the Sami, the Inuit, where round hide drums, bone masks and dream-shaped fur garments were not symbols, but tools for speaking with the universe. When villages vanished, when ice melted and seas swallowed the land, when scattered groups never found one another again, it was the shamans who formed the final link of identity. They could not save the land, but they saved the story. And as long as the story was told, part of the old world kept breathing. In the frostbitten legends of the north, there are cities under ice, spirits turning into white bears, people flying between earth and sky on threads of northern light. For modern scholars, these are myths, but for the shamans, they were memory, not written in words, but in images, in sounds, in silence. Shamans did not teach through logic, they taught through symbols. A kind of storytelling no one can fully explain, yet everyone can feel. And they were the last to understand that in the land of snow there is more than death. Every pale line across the ice is not emptiness, but a seam where two worlds meet. Every midnight ritual is a way of holding the connection, where the living whisper to the gone, where prayers do not need to be heard, only felt. These rituals, now only faintly preserved in descendant cultures, were once the final method by which a civilization refused to be erased. No language needed, only rhythm. When fire was gone, they shaped ritual from ice. When earth was too frozen to draw circles, they lifted their drums to the sky. When no one remembered, they remembered on behalf of the whole world, not for glory, but because if no one held on to the old truths, no one would know that this land once had a soul. And so they continued, not to live longer, but so memory would not be swallowed by the silence of time. And today, when we stand on white, frozen ground, believing there is nothing here but wind, perhaps, very softly, a breath from the ancient world passes over us, not to recount the past, but to ask, if they held memory together when everything else collapsed, then now as the modern world loses its bearings, who will hold it for us? Who will be the shaman of this age? Who will tell the story that seems to have disappeared? In a place where paper crumbles from moisture, where pens freeze in the cold, where ink thins into mist, there is no room for traditional maps, but that does not mean the people here had no maps. They simply chose not to write them down. In the white, seamless world of the North, where every direction looks the same, where every layer of ice repeats, survival required a special ability, remembering space through intuition, through footsteps, through the scent of wind and the taste of snow. Ancient fishers could travel hundreds of kilometers across trackless ice to return to the exact spot where they had a good catch the year before. Reindeer herders could lead their herds through snow deserts by recalling the landscape beneath the ice, the mounds, the cliffs, the hidden streams passed down through generational memory. They walked without trails because the trail lived inside them, not as vague instinct, but as a system, a culture of mapping, not written, but carved into the mind like an ancient tattoo. The Inuit have the concept of Inoyomi Arnik, the memory map, where space is encoded through storytelling, imagery, footsteps, even dreams. The Samis sing joik not simply to tell stories, but to guide memory, each melodic phrase representing a river, a slope, a patch of good grazing. Their songs were not just music, they were breathing maps. Ways to remember the path home, even when no path remained. It is easy to mistake the absence of written materials for the absence of structured thought. But sometimes limitation creates extraordinary forms. Without paper, they mapped through song, through drums, through the twisting gesture of a hand while telling a story. Without GPS, they found direction in the color of light reflecting on ice, in the flow of a river beneath snow. Their maps did not lie in their hands, they lived behind their foreheads, in steady breath and unwavering steps. This ability did not arise from savagery, but from a refined system of spatial organization where navigation did not rely on fixed landmarks, but on changes in light, on the direction of bird flight, on the taste of wind in one's mouth. And so we must ask, if a community can design maps through memory, encode the environment through layered language, navigate by rhythm, are they merely primitive hunter-gatherers, or are they a culture advanced in their own way? One ethnographer once wrote, "An Arctic nomad can close his eyes and draw in his mind a route stretching hundreds of kilometers, with rest points, water cracks, wind directions, and animal behavior, as if a living map had formed over a lifetime of memory. That memory is not learned from books, but from life, not taught, but lived. Each journey carves a new mark into the mind. Each return confirms that the map remains true. And if a culture can draw maps into the mind of each new generation, passed from life to life, then is that not the most enduring form of map? It does not rot, it does not burn, it cannot be swept away like ancient manuscripts. It disappears only when no one walks the path anymore. When no one remembers, the map is finally lost. and sometimes all that remains is a path no one dares to step onto, not because it is gone, but because the map has slipped out of human memory. They did not leave the north like people running from disaster. They left like people carrying fire. Not the fire that warms the hands, but the fire of memory. When the last generations of the ancient Arctic culture were forced to withdraw before the climate, before the advancing ice, before the disappearance of herds and fishing grounds, they could not take everything that had once shaped their world. They left behind homes, camps, ivory altars. But they carried what could never be buried, myths, rituals, and drum rhythms that needed no written script. Their migration was not simply movement southward. It was smoke sinking into new soil, a whisper carried on the wind, a cultural diffusion so quiet and so steady that history barely noticed it. There were no chronicles, no records, only strange traces that began to appear like ancient dust inside other cultures. A ritual mask carved near Lake Baikal, resembling the aurora masks once used in the far north, a double spiral motif tied to the symbol of the north wind, showing up on totems of tribes separated by thousands of kilometers. A story of a cold man from the far north carrying a guiding drum for the souls appears in the tales of indigenous groups in Alaska and also among the earliest peoples of Canada. Was it coincidence, or the footprints of a culture that did not fade, but simply dissolved into others? Because the most striking truth is this: when they left, they were no longer a single tribe. They were fragments. They wove themselves into other migratory waves. But their spirit did not die. It scattered, and then it grew again. It lived in the way people looked at the aurora and spoke of it as the soul gate. It lived in stories of ancestors arriving from a land where the sun never fully rose, only flickered like a spirit still searching for release. It lived in the belief that the north was not a dead place, but the cradle of ancient wisdom, of beginnings. It lived in the imagination that the harshest land had once been the gentlest, where people spoke to the unseen through drums, through wind, through carved stone. Across the Altai Mountains, the Urals, and the old land bridge between Asia and the Americas, people still tell origin stories pointing to a northern homeland, a place of wind speakers where a drum could open the gate between worlds. These are not just remnants of folklore. They are living embers of an ancient cultural stream that once shaped a world now buried beneath snow. What remains is not architecture, but symbols, not ruins, but memory, not monuments, but echoes. And here lies the strange truth. When a civilization collapses, it does not crumble into dust. It becomes pollen in the wind, drifting everywhere. And where it finds good soil, it grows into belief. It needs no stone walls, no written language, no kingdom. Only a child listening to a story beside the fire. And through that story, a piece of memory lives one more lifetime. When the people left the ice, they did not abandon their memory. They planted it across every land they touched. Though their names, their language, and their mind maps have all faded, we still see their shadow in our own myths, a mask with no clear origin, a legend with no known beginning, a drum rhythm that strikes the listener's heart, as if from a very distant past someone is still calling home. They say he came from the north, wrapped in a heavy fur cloak like an ancient layer of frost, stepping out of a boat shaped like the spine of a whale, speaking no common language, yet understanding how to listen to the sky. He has no name in written history, but in the oral memory of many indigenous nations across North America, from the Inuit to the Tlingit, from the Dene to the Algonquin, his story lingers like hearth smoke clinging to canvas. A tale repeated again and again, shifting in detail but keeping the same breath. There were people from the north who once arrived carrying fire, carrying markings, and then slipped away without a sound. Is it only a metaphor, or a historical memory weathered by time but never erased? There are traces as fragile as ancient ripples pressed into stone, spearheads unlike the Clovis tradition, spiral-shaped stone arrangements echoing old Arctic rites, and red ochre burial pigments matching those used in the Kara region and Siberia. They are not enough to declare a verdict, but they cannot be dismissed. It is as though the artifacts themselves are asking us, who was it that forgot first? Even stranger are the mythic patterns. The Tlingit speak of ancestors who once lived in a land without night, where green light swirled overhead like dancing spirits. The Mi'kmaq tell of souls traveling northward to meet their ancestors, and of ancient visitors who moved against the direction of migrating birds. These stories neither prove nor deny. They simply whisper about people who came, pitched their shelters, taught how to live with ice, how to read wind and snow, and then disappeared like morning mist that no one remembers naming. There was no war, no conquest, only a brief but deep presence, as if they knew they were not meant to stay, but to deliver a message meant to outlast them. If so, then the ancient Arctic civilization did not end where it began. It drifted outward like invisible smoke, drawing faint lines through human memory, hiding inside drum rhythms, tattoos, lullabies, and a quiet sense of something sacred arriving from the north that no one can fully recall. The Inuit today still keep an old word, impossible to translate into any modern language, used for those who came from a north even farther than the north. It does not describe a tribe, it describes a feeling. Not the people themselves, but the sense that someone once arrived carrying light in their chest, then left when the world began to shift. No monuments left behind, no writing, only a pale streak stretching across time, perceptible only to those sensitive enough to feel presence without proof. Perhaps those ancient travelers, leaving the realm of eternal ice, scattered fragments of their spirit into the land, the wind, and the light, not through language, but through a kind of presence felt through skin, through stillness, through the quiet gratitude of watching the aurora bloom. When the first waves of humans settled the places we now call Canada, Greenland, or the western coast of the United States, they may not have known the names of those who came before, but they lived the way those earlier people once lived. And that is how memory survives, not by remembering, but by continuing. Civilization does not always leave pyramids. Sometimes it leaves a tilt in an old story, a spiral in a tattoo, a feeling with no name that rises when you stand in white snow and suddenly feel your heart soften. This is a civilization made of breath, quiet, unobtrusive, drifting, seeping, hiding away, waiting to see who still carries the rhythm of the drum inside their chest. And if we listen deeply enough, we might sense a distant echo still trembling beneath the earth, not to retell a story that has passed, but to ensure that the story never fully goes dark. If the far side of the Atlantic is where northern echoes barely brushed human memory before fading like smoke, then in the heart of the Eurasian continent, those echoes did not disappear. They seeped into the soil, merged with myth, and quietly returned in different forms. The footsteps that left the polar world did not all drift south. Some threaded along mountain chains, travelled with the steppe winds, and blended into the nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples who moved across the cold, dry lands stretching from the Urals to Siberia. And when these people arrived, they carried more than their bodies. They carried a layer of ancient feeling even they could no longer name. In the cultures of the Samoyed, Evenki, Khanty and several early Turkic groups, there remain vague tales of those who came from the north. Silent spirit guides, white people in the snow, living embodiments of light that walks with the wind. These are not descriptions of weather. They are metaphors for something sacred that once stood among them. Such symbols do not come from warm lands. They do not arise from open plains. They belong to a place now buried beneath ice, a place where memory was once a way of existing. Tracing this thread across time, from Proto-Uralic groups to early Indo-Iranian branches, from ancient communities near Lake Baikal to the Kazakh steppe, reveals fragments that do not match the dry climate of later eras. Symbols of hunting in snow, structures built not for farming, but for ritual. Mammoth ivory blocks, drawings of skylight, circular motifs carved deeply into stone. They are footprints left on frozen ground, fading but never fully gone. From this, a quiet idea forms like a seed riding the wind, that the people who abandoned the far north did not disappear, but dissolved into other cultures, planting strange markers in their languages, rituals, and beliefs. Archaeological traces in northern Kazakhstan and around Lake Baikal show sudden appearances of practices foreign to local tradition, mammoth-related rites, ivory tools, depictions of a heavenly gate, things that could not have grown on their own without roots in an icy world long vanished. But time does not simply blur footprints, it crushes the maps beneath them. The very communities that once absorbed these influences gradually lost the ability to explain the origins of the symbols they carried. They transformed into old customs, into the way things were always done, into practices everyone knew, but no one remembered why. Thus, this loss happened not through destruction, but through dilution, so complete it became invisible. This is the most subtle form of disappearance. No extinction, only melting. When northern peoples blended into the societies of Eurasia, they did not seek to conquer, they did not need to dominate. They left behind only grains of meaning and let the wind scatter them. Languages shifted, names vanished, but the sense of polar light, of templeless ritual, of sacred wind breath remained, like a layer of smoke resting beneath soft grass, waiting for someone perceptive enough to stir it. And the more complex, populous civilizations inherited these elements and then forgot their source. They kept the rituals but forgot the reasons. They repeated the symbols but renamed them. In this way, the ancient Arctic civilization was not buried, it was diluted, and because of that, it is harder to trace than one that was destroyed outright. So how many beliefs, symbols, and motifs we think of as purely Eurasian carry a thread of memory from somewhere farther away, whiter, colder? No one knows. But standing on the wide steppe, when the northern wind brushes the skin like a memory not yet dissolved, you can feel something still alive. It does not require proof, only attention, because the wind never stops blowing from the direction of what has been lost. Not all ancient memories choose to travel through human mouths. Some are recorded in scorched earth, in light that did not come from any campfire, but from the sky itself, as if the universe once lost its temper, and its silent fury fell upon the world in a soundless scream. Scattered whispers in the legends of the Nenets, Chukchi, Inuit, and indigenous groups across Alaska have long spoken of a strange night. The night when the sky caught fire, no moon, no stars, only a noon-bright glow carrying a sound that belonged to no living creature ever known. For a long time, scholars dismissed these stories as metaphor, poetic ways to describe blizzards or auroras, but when compared with deep sediment layers, rich with ash, unusual platinum, and signs of slow-burning heat. Another possibility emerged, colder than any ice. Perhaps such a night truly happened. And maybe not just once. It may have been the result of a supervolcanic eruption, blasting dust straight into the stratosphere and dimming the sun for years. Or something worse, a meteor exploding through the atmosphere like a colossal Tunguska, only larger, nearer, and timed perfectly to interrupt a young culture just finding its first breath after the Ice Age. In ancient Greenland ice cores, scientists found layers rich in sulfur and platinum, aligning with sudden climate shifts. In Yakutia and Kamchatka, blackened sediment settled across lake beds, not laid down by time, but by a land that once seemed to burn from within. The memory of disaster does not live only in earth. It lives in lullabies, in mythic imagery, in the way elders recount things as if dreaming. Tales of ground shaking like a hooked fish, of light melting through stone, of the sun being swallowed by a smoke that refused to fade. This is not imagination. It is trauma made visible. It is how a culture without writing preserved terror, in drums, in chants, in stories repeated not to explain, but to hold. No one knows for certain whether it was volcano, meteor, or a chain of calamities woven together, but all evidence points to one truth. After that night, the human map changed, migration routes bent, populated lands emptied, old beliefs were replaced by a new caution, toward the sky. Because from that moment on, the gods were no longer benevolent beings above. The sky was no longer protective. The sky could fall. And fire, the sacred symbol across countless cultures, began to carry two faces, warmth and warning. Flames lit upon the snow were no longer just signs of life. They were marks of fear. For those who survived a night when light fell from above, to burn the world, every light afterward carried the echo of a funeral bell. Strangely, that memory never died, though 3, 4, 5 millennia have passed. Stories of the burning sky are still told, not with dates, but with symbols, metaphors, and the silent way an elder looks upward before falling quiet. It forces us to stop asking, did it truly happen? And instead ask something deeper, colder. Why has time failed to erase it? Perhaps some nights only need to happen once to be carved forever into the human mind. Nights when even after the earth has changed colors, languages have shifted, and voices have gone silent, one image remains suspended in the sky, like a falling streak of light that has never quite reached the ground. After the fire came silence, but not the silence of healing, the silence of freezing. The cold did not arrive like an invader with screams or proclamations. It simply spread night by night, month by month, century by century, as if summer were fading into a memory no one could quite recall. There was no apocalypse, no great flood. Only the quiet death of life when winter refused to retreat anymore. Only the final lights dimming, unnoticed. In that moment, the Arctic was no longer a home. It became a graveyard, not for bodies, for memory. Ritual stone piles, ivory altars, old caribou trails, all buried under permafrost. The mental maps carved by generations were erased by a single thin layer of ice. No one walked the old routes. No one remembered where laughter once echoed. A fragile crust of frozen ground was enough to hide an entire world forever. Today, when scientists drill into Greenland or Siberia, searching for paleoclimate data, they are really probing the memory of the Earth. Each layer of ice, each season, each century, holds more than carbon, ash, or temperature shifts. It holds the last breath of communities buried not by war or conquest, but simply because summer never returned, and that makes the sorrow heavier, quieter. This is not a story of collapse. This is a story of being forgotten. No tombs, no storytellers, no stone markers, no written records, only a world left behind as humanity moved toward warmth, as if we had dropped an entire chapter of ourselves into a frozen vault and convinced ourselves it never existed. Some memories drifted south, surviving as fragments in ritual and myth, but most did not. They froze, and in freezing, they vanished. When ice persists long enough, it doesn't only hide objects, it hides questions. The world stopped asking, who lived here? And instead assumed no one ever could have lived here. In that way, cold didn't just kill life, it killed curiosity. It smothered every hypothesis. And humans, creatures built from stories, suddenly had no story left to tell about the North. Eventually, like a reflex for survival, people stopped returning. They walked toward the sun, toward lands that didn't seal shut, toward places where memory could breathe. And the North? It remained, uncomplaining, unnamed, waiting like a locked room no one remembers having a key to. Because sometimes the most terrifying loss is not the fall of a civilization, but losing the ability to believe that civilization ever existed. No towering ruins, no grand temples, just white, just emptiness, a place where no one asks anything anymore, and because no one asks, nothing answers. Yet memory doesn't die, it only waits for someone willing to stand in the snow and call it back. For someone who listens to the cold wind as though it carries a whisper. For someone who watches long enough to realize that the emptiest place is often the one most filled with what has been buried. And in that way, civilization does not end, it merely winters. Not everything disappeared. A few people remained, not heroes, not great messengers, just a handful of families, a few bloodlines, a few individuals suspended between two ages. They did not freeze with their cities. They were not swept away by waves, nor burned by fire, nor buried under ice. They simply kept going. They left early enough or stayed long enough to learn how to bow before the wind. They were no longer citizens of a civilization. They were the living remnants of a world already gone. They did not carry temples with them. They no longer held a complete map of memory. Their interregional hunting systems were broken, their ritual ivory markers lost. What remained were stories. A few songs, a few drum rhythms, a few symbols carved into whalebone. And strangely, those fragments proved stronger than stone. In a lullaby no one understands anymore, in a spiral drawn by hand on the ground, in a gaze drifting toward the distant white horizon, something still breathes, something not yet extinguished. The survivors did not tell history the way people who truly remembered do. They repeated something vague, like a breath fading into snow. That once this place was warm. That the aurora had once been a doorway for souls. That the cold had not always been a pursuer, but a friend. But as generations passed, memory softened, colored by symbols. No one could separate truth from metaphor anymore. Mammoths that sang, people who could step into the dreams of others, rivers that knew how to guide. When memory could no longer reach back, humans built symbols to hold on, not because they were superstitious, but because they could not bear the idea that everything could vanish without a trace. A dance, a carved mark, a whispered phrase. These were not language. They were the final claws gripping a world about to fall away. And in that grasp, symbols became inheritance, not to be understood, but to keep forgetting at bay. We once believed only writing could preserve history. But for them, the last people of the ancient North, it was the unwritable that survived, a stone circle placed in the wrong place, a way of sewing fur clothing unlike any other, a legend about ancestors who came from a place so white it had no shadows. These fragments, scattered and incomplete, still carried a breath from the old world. And so they continued. They plucked a stone-stringed instrument, even though no one remembered the melody. They wore fur, stood in the wind, closed their eyes as if trying to recall something important lost 10 generations ago. No one appointed them as historians. They were simply the ones who remained. And strangely, it was their uncertainty that allowed them to survive. Because you do not need to understand something in order to keep it alive. You only need to repeat it, to move your hands to an old drum beat, to carve strange lines into soft wood, to tell children stories about a land no one dares name anymore. And that alone is enough to keep memory from dying. And perhaps, in the dreams of children born far from the sun, in a lullaby with no literal meaning, in a piece of carved bone found beneath the ice, perhaps there, that forgotten civilization is still breathing. It does not need recognition. It only needs not to be erased. None of the last storytellers of the far north ever called their homeland Hyperborea. They knew nothing of Thule on ancient Greek maps, nor could they imagine that their white, drifting dreams would one day reach the libraries of Athens or Rome. They did not use maps. They did not write histories, but they told stories. They beat rhythms on animal skin drums. They breathed into the cold, and in that breath they held something that later generations would give a strange name to. The land beyond the north wind. Hyperborea. Beyond the north wind. A place without war, without sickness, without the kind of winter that kills life. A realm of gentle light, where the sun never sets, where daylight stretches longer than darkness. Not belonging to Zeus, but a land where gods themselves supposedly went to rest. It sounds like a fairy tale, a dreamscape, imagined by southern thinkers who had never stepped onto white snow. But if we have seen how the Arctic was once warm, alive, breathing, then perhaps Hyperborea is not myth, but a fossilized memory. The same is true of Thule, the land described by Pythias, an ancient Greek sailor, who spoke of a place where earth, water, and air become one. A description vague and dreamlike, yet eerily similar to the half-frozen, half-mist world of the permafrost north. Perhaps he never reached it. Perhaps he just heard the stories. But that does not make the stories less true. Sometimes a person describes what they do not understand using the most poetic images their language allows. Could it be that Pythias or Pythagoras or even Herodotus brushed against the fading edge of a memory worn down by seawater, snow, and time? They had no evidence, but they had stories from northern traders, from wandering sailors, from people who had seen strange lights dancing in the sky and did not know what to call them. And so those fragments drifted south and settled into myth. When a memory is incomplete, does it become a mistake? Or does it become a symbol? Perhaps Hyperborea was never a place but a longing, a metaphor for a time when humans lived in harmony with nature, unafraid of wind or cold, when light was a companion and winter was only the season for storytelling by the fire. A time when the far north was not the end of the world, but its beginning. As that memory travelled south, it lost its details, but it remained alive. It put on the clothing of myth. It wore the language of poetry. It became a symbol no one could fully trust, yet no one could dismiss, and that alone made it stronger. Because in the human mind, the thing that survives longest is not the event itself, but the feeling of the event. And when scholars wrote down names like Hyperborea, Thule, or the land where gods go to rest, they did not know they were copying an ancient echo, a reverberation from a world with no surviving ruins, no temples, no language, no names, only aftershocks. And in that way, the memory, though no one remembers it clearly, has never truly died, because perhaps every myth about unending light, every tale of a land that does not die, every story of a traveler who brought fire and then vanished, is an echo from somewhere that once existed. A place that may have been cold, but was never without a soul. A place no one can name anymore, yet one that never stopped whispering through the wind. Not everything forgotten lies beneath deep ice or at the bottom of a black sea. Some things sit right in front of us, quiet, unassuming, like winter leaves clinging to a bare branch. Too small to be called evidence, yet too persistent to disappear. A spear tip off by a few thousand years. An ivory pin with no known origin. A carved motif appearing on both sides of an ocean that no one can explain. All of them fragments, the kind science once dismissed. Not because they lacked value, but because they did not fit the historical picture we were used to. They did not match the notion that the North was a dead zone, a fringe beyond life. But when those tiny fragments are placed together by hands without prejudice, they begin to tell a story, not loudly, not dramatically, but patiently, like a whisper that has waited far too long to be heard again. On a coastal cliff in Siberia, an ancient hunting camp was uncovered, where people once built windbreaks from mammoth tusks, not just for shelter, but possibly for ceremony. A skeleton with unusual genetics not matching any known community, yet showing shared ancestry with both Eastern Europe and the Americas. A stone slab carved with spirals and tree shapes appearing across continents, suggesting a long-lost symbolic language once linking people whose names have vanished. And then there are frozen sediment samples holding pollen from plants that no longer grow there. Pollen, like the memory of forests, proving that there was once a time when the climate here was warm enough to sustain communities who did more than survive. They lived deeply, they did not need pyramids, they left no frozen cities, they did not carve grand monuments. They only needed to exist long enough to leave a small dot in the soil, a faint echo in the genome, a blurred whisper in legend. The strange thing is this: when researchers, archaeologists, geneticists, geologists, symbolists, began listening to one another, they realized that what seemed meaningless was slowly arranging itself into a map. Not a territorial map, but a map of a way of life, a worldview that once took root in the cold and never fully died. A map without borders, yet full of direction. And in that map, the North is no longer a silent blank. It becomes a home, the center of a system built on perception rather than control, on harmony with wind, snow, ice, and fragility. A culture that grew not outward but inward, not built of stone but of memory, not expanding territory but expanding awareness. We almost missed all of it because it did not shout like war. It did not etch its power into rock like empires. It simply breathed softly through time. Soft enough not to break anything, but long enough to still be here, like a slow breath between two ice ages. And now, thanks to new tools and thanks to people willing to listen to what no one could articulate, that memory begins to return. Not as a proclamation, but as a light, not as an answer, but as a question that asks, if an entire culture could exist and humanity nearly overlooked it, how many more memories are still waiting, hidden in dust, stone, wind, and symbols we have never learned to read? Perhaps the history of the North was never absent at all. It was simply written in a kind of ink our eyes were not yet trained to see. There is a paradox in the way humanity looks at ice. We often see it as a white curtain drawn over the past, a ruthless eraser. Yet it is that very absolute cold that preserves things more perfectly than anything else on Earth. Ice is not just a symbol of forgetting, it is the most faithful archive this planet has ever created, a place where time does not flow like a river, but lies still like a snow-covered mirror. What disappears in warm lands, fabric rotting, wood dissolving, bone turning to dust, remains intact here. When a culture collapses in the tropics, it leaves behind bricks, a few shards of pottery, a line or two of inscriptions worn thin by the wind, but in the far north, a footprint in frozen mud, a single hair carried by the cold, a scrap of woven wool. All of it can remain untouched for tens of thousands of years, not decayed, not broken down, just waiting. The deep ice cores of Greenland, Siberia, and Alaska do not only hold ancient air bubbles, they hold volcanic ash from eruptions long quiet, pollen from forests that no longer exist, and things even smaller, plant spores from species that have vanished from the earth. Each layer of ice is a diary entry, not written in words but in sediment, not divided into chapters but into temperatures, wind directions, and sulfur concentrations. And hidden beneath those layers of climate, there is something deeper. The imprint of human presence, not in books but in their bodies. Unnamed mummies lying motionless for millennia, their tattoos still visible. A curled finger, as if still gripping a stone blade. A hunting camp emerging as the last sheet of ice melts away, exposing animal bones laid out in some ritual no one remembers. They left no manuscripts, no carved stelae, no claims to empire. But they lived. They breathed. They looked up at the northern sky, where the aurora moved like a wordless song. And ice preserved them, as if the earth refused to let this memory be lost. As if it chose not to speak immediately, but to wait for the right time. Perhaps that time is now. As climate change shifts from warning to reality, melting each layer of frozen ground, the past begins to rise, slowly but unstoppable. Tools once thought gone are reappearing. Ancient DNA locked inside frozen cells is speaking again in languages no one has ever heard. Strands of fur, faint charcoal stains, scraps of old textile, all returning like whispered reminders of a world that was once profoundly alive, not primitive, not wild, but intricate, ceremonial, observant, and capable of forgetting. Yet their forgetting was never final, it was merely frozen. And now, as the ice retreats, the story is being told again, not in words, but in presence. We are standing before an archive that no one built, not a museum, not a temple, but the living memory of the planet, opening layer by layer like an onion, inviting anyone patient enough to read it. But the question is no longer, what will we find? That question is outdated. The real question is, are we ready to understand what we are seeing? Because the past is not simply what happened. The past is a mirror. And some mirrors humanity has never dared look into. Ice does not speak, it only keeps. It keeps until someone quiet enough leans in to listen. And when we do, we will see that beneath that cold, indifferent surface are heartbeats that once raced, eyes that once watched the sky, stories once told in voices now gone. The history of the North never died. It has simply been lying there, silent, cold, but whole, waiting to be called by its name again. When we talk about the collapse of a civilization, the mind usually paints scenes of great floods, burning walls, and invading footsteps echoing across ancient stone. But not every ending arrives with sound. Sometimes the end comes the way the last snow of winter melts under spring sunlight, without warning, without ruin, without mourning. Only a steady, gradual absence, like a shadow slipping out of the light. Perhaps the ancient civilization of the North withdrew in that quiet way. Not conquered, not burned to ash, but simply drifting beyond the world's ability to remember. No more steady footprints across snowfields. No more ivory posts raised beside frozen lakes. No more language to call the aurora by its ancient names. Everything slowly dissolved into silence, as if it had never been loud, as if it had been born only to leave softly. Those who survived carried with them not maps or manuscripts, but fragments of memory. A short song, a carved line no one understands anymore, a way of hunting reindeer after the first snowfall. A story about the pale people who came from the direction of the cold wind. Not relics of glory, sowing but seeds. And those seeds settled into other lands and other communities, taking root quietly. Perhaps we were mistaken. When we looked at an empty archaeological map, we concluded that nothing was ever here. When we saw no fortresses, we assumed this was not a civilization. But if there are cultures that lived more by memory than by stone, more by story than by writing, more by ritual than by law, then their disappearance leaves no ruins. It becomes the foundation, a foundation unseen, yet everything after it stands upon it. And so disappearance is not always loss. Loss does not mean never was. Some things exist without needing to keep their old shape. A civilization may lose its name, its markers, its architecture, yet still flow in the bloodstream of other peoples. Like an ancient melody hidden inside a new tune, like an old motif woven into a modern pattern, like a forgotten rhythm beating softly inside a newborn ritual. They are no longer called by their old names, but they remain present. In genetics, in faith, in a repeated chant no one understands yet feels compelled to sing, in swirling motifs carved on stones thousands of miles from where they once lived. They do not exist in written history, but in a deeper memory, a memory that needs no naming. Like the faint echo of a lullaby someone heard in childhood, still humming in their dreams for a lifetime. And perhaps that is what ice truly does. It does not preserve the shape, but the essence. It allows what seemed gone to return in another form, softer, lighter, but no less real. The way a glacier that melts does not vanish. It simply finds a new path, a new shape, and continues on. Maybe that is how their civilization lives now. Not in monuments or written myths, but in the invisible current of things that still go on. And in that way they were never lost. They became the soil in which new dreams grow. They became the ground that present light shines upon. They became the memory of life itself, not to be glorified, but to remind us ice does not melt to erase. It melts so what was kept inside, it can return in a new form. They lived here long before the Arctic was ever called tundra, long before ice became the defining word. Before this place was painted as a blank white mass on maps, it was a green world, with forests, lakes, rivers, and coastlines warmer than we imagine. And within those ancient landscapes there were people. Not myths, not speculation, but traces. The carved tip of a mammoth-boned spear, a line of stones arranged so straight it feels as if someone once measured them by sight, a strange genetic signature appearing in Siberia, Canada, and even Scandinavia, ere then vanishing. Piece by piece their silhouette emerges, not sharply, but enough to see they were here. They were not wanderers surviving in the cold, but people who chose to live here when the land was still abundant. They may have left no cities, yet they left structures of the mind, no writing, yet a network of stories and symbols repeating from Asia to the Americas. Spirals, world tree motifs, cyclical time, not coincidences but echoes of a shared symbolic language that once moved across the ice. They might be ancestors of many peoples or a distinct lineage with no surviving descendants. They might have been intermediaries in ancient trade networks or simply the original inhabitants of a gentle interglacial world. but in every possibility they were part of Earth's story, not as a footnote, but as a forgotten opening chapter. One thing is certain, they lived in a time official history refuses to see, a period labelled pre-civilized, an empty space once assumed uninhabited, a time absent from recorded chronicles, yet present in soil, in ice, in ancestral dreams, and because of that they became invisible in the story of humanity. Not taught in textbooks, not mentioned in museums, no kingdom, no emperors, no medals. Yet they had eyes, rhythms, and a way of walking across snow as if snow were not an obstacle but a natural part of the day. Every time a layer of ice melts, a tool appears, or an unplaced strand of DNA is uncovered. It is a whisper rising again. We were here. Not shouting, not demanding, only a light but undeniable presence, like the faint echo of a voice once familiar. They are the memory we are trying to name, hidden among scattered data points, incomplete evidence, and a quiet intuition that history is far from complete. And in the process of piecing these fragments together, perhaps what we are truly searching for is not only them, but the missing part of ourselves. Not every civilization leaves behind temples, not every memory becomes a written history, and not every life that has vanished is truly gone. Some things survive only as a thin breath inside the ice, as faint echoes carried by the northern wind, as a blurred silhouette buried in old Inuit or Sami stories, long after everyone has forgotten who first told them. Perhaps it is precisely because the Arctic seems too harsh, too empty, too impossible for life, that whatever once existed here becomes even harder to believe. But once we understand that there was a time when the Arctic was not frozen, when people lived, travelled, and remembered the paths across this land, when the faint traces they left mirror symbols found in the Americas or as far as the Ural Mountains, we can no longer call it coincidence. We begin to call it memory. Not the kind etched into stone or carved in gold, but the kind you can only see when light slips through the ice at just the right angle. A lullaby that somehow survived, a symbol that repeats across continents, a way of living modern people no longer understand, yet still feel in their bones, and as if something once belonged to us, long, long ago. Memory is never truly lost, it only changes form. It doesn't need to be fully understood to continue existing. It lives like a seed asleep in the cold earth, not dead, only waiting. And sometimes it only needs to be touched by a deep quiet, the way ancient northern peoples listened to the shifting ice, listened to the sky, listened to the souls drifting through the wind. We cannot be certain who they were. We cannot paint a complete portrait. We cannot speak the name they used for themselves. But we can be certain they left something behind, a gentle way of living, a quiet kind of connection, a way of understanding nature that requires no conquest, only attention. A posture toward the cold, not fear, but respect, not in the form of monuments, but in an invisible architecture of ideas, a soft order with no walls at all. Something that may have travelled south with migrating peoples, threading itself into beliefs, into art, perhaps even into dreams whose origins we no longer recognize. Light as first snow, and still present somewhere between layers of ice, in a memory not yet awakened. Maybe we don't need to find everything. We don't need to recover every bone, every trail, every carved motif, because the deepest things are not out there. They echo inside the memory structure of humanity itself, like a buried voice that was never fully silenced, like a thin breath still moving through the cultural bloodstream. And so perhaps we do not need to find them at all. We do not need maps or timelines to prove they were real. We only need to listen long enough, to feel their presence inside the quiet, to remember this simple truth: they never truly left.